Hey garden family, it is your girl Raven Epiphany, and I am here with a quick message for you guys. I had shared this with some of my family and friends a few weeks ago, and now I feel led to share it with you. And it says, who are you? If you took away the layers of your accomplishments, titles, material gains, etc., and the expectations of the world, how would you define your true essence? And then I went on to tell them, if you haven't already, I pray you give yourself a chance to discover what God said about you long before you were born. You deserve to know your identity and to walk in that fully and unapologetically. And so I am sharing that with you today. Each of us deserves to know that thing that God said about us before He even formed us in our mother's womb, so that we may walk fully in our true identities and not the ones that the world has put on us, not the ones that trauma put on us, not the ones that, we just conjured up for ourselves just because, that's what we thought or felt, without God's guidance. And so I want to ask you today, who are you for real, for real? Who did God create you to be? And those are not questions that you can usually answer in one day if you haven't already, spent time pondering those things with God. It's not even necessarily something that is usually answered in just, a moment or a few weeks. It's usually a journey with God, for Him taking off the layers and then, uncovering the things that He already deposited in you long ago. And so there has to be a few things that happen. And these are usually things that God will lead you through, if you will submit to Jesus and allow Him to, take you through this process. And so one would be to make time to detach from the world and to get in touch with God and your true self. And so that may mean being off of social media for a season or seasons. That may mean, God calling you out of places and spaces that you've grown comfortable. It may not have to be as dramatic as my journey was, moving across the country by yourself and just being there with God, It may be just that God even takes you through a process of emotionally and mentally detaching from certain places, just so you can see differently, see outside of the, boxes that you have been living in. So whatever that looks like, it usually will require some level of detachment from the world that you are used to in order to, get in touch with who God says that you are. When we think about Abraham, he said, get thee from your father's household and go to a place that I will show you. And so, it may be that physically you are leaving a place. It may be, that, like I said, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, you are leaving a place so that God can show you who you truly are. Because, our environment can kind of affect who we show up as when we haven't already been cultivated to be that person that God would call us to be. Our environments and the advice of others and the influences around us can definitely impact, how we show up, impact how we see ourselves when we haven't already been fortified in the secret place with God. And so it may require some level of detachment. It likely will require some level of detachment, whether literally, God saying, leave that job, leave that place, leave this, leave that, or, Him taking you through a process of renewing your mind where you're separated from that, in different ways. The next thing is it requires vulnerability with yourself and with God. It requires you digging deep into those truths that you don't necessarily want to touch all the time. Those truths that, maybe have been buried deep down that you never really, never or haven't in a long time allowed yourself to uncover, allowed yourself to ponder, allowed yourself to, explore, essentially. It requires you to really see yourself as you are right now and to see yourself, the ways that God created you, and to make room to see yourself how God sees you. And both of those, all of that process is very vulnerable because it requires a level of truth that we in our everyday lives, when things are moving quickly, that we don't have to uncover, that we can keep moving without uncovering, that we can pretend isn't there, that we can ignore, that we can get so comfortable in where we are that we, never even scratch the surface of those things, of how we really are, self-awareness of how and where we really are right now. And then the truth of the ultimate capital T truth of how God created us and who God created us to be. Very vulnerable, especially when you get to that level of, okay, God, who do you say I am? Because a lot of times who God says you are is a lot higher, a lot more powerful, a lot more divine, obviously a lot more divine, and just even more beautiful than you can imagine about yourself. And, that identity that God gives you requires Him. And so obviously if it requires Him, it's going to be bigger than, something you can come into by yourself, that you can carry by yourself. And so it can be a bit intimidating at first. It can be vulnerable to accept that and to receive that. But regardless, it requires you to be vulnerable with yourself, be vulnerable with God, and be willing to uncover those truths about yourself that, like I said, when you're busy all the time, that you don't even have to pay attention to. It often and likely will require a process of shedding the old and being adorned with the true. Not just the new, but the true. Because some of these things are not even new. They may be new to you because, again, you haven't uncovered them. But they are ultimately the truth of what God said about you before he formed you in your mother's womb long ago, And so we have to be willing to commit to that process. And I'm not here to pretend that it's going to be a week, that it's going to be 2 weeks, that it's even going to be a month. Like, this is a journey, and yeah, it takes time, because it takes time of you cultivating your relationship with God enough to get to know who he is, because we're made in his image. And so, as I've said before, the more that you get to know who he is, the more your eyes can be open to who he created you to be. If we're made in his image, we got to know, the original first before we can really have a revelation about, the replica that he has made within us and what that is ultimately supposed to look like. And so we have to be willing to commit to that process, whatever that looks like. And a lot of times, God will take us through the shallow waters first. And, kind of like going into the ocean. You step your toes in, you walk in, then it comes up to your calves, then your knees, then your waist. And then, next thing you know, you are wading in the water. That is usually how this process is going to go. For some people, it may be a dive off the diving board into the deep, maybe. But regardless, you have to be willing to commit to that process, whatever that looks like. It may take time. It will take time. It may take tears, hard moments, etc. But exchanging a mundane, purposeless, inauthentic life and version of yourself will be worth the abundance, freedom, and authenticity that awaits only the truest version of you, the one God created and knew before you were born. And so trading in that, this is the status quo. This is just, how life is. This is the box that I was handed. This is how things have to be. And trading that in for, this is actually what God said about me, what God has spoken and written about my life. The Bible says that God has books written about our lives. And so we want, ideally, our lives to line up with what he wrote about us long ago, and so it may not be, it's not necessarily sin if you don't match up with that. But I don't know about you, I want that perfect plan as much as possible. And so I'm not going to stress myself out about it, but I do want to yield myself to God's process in order to get as close to that, if not right on it, as possible, and allow the Lord to order my footsteps. And so be willing to trade in the mundane, even if you have a good life. Sometimes, and a lot of times, God asks us to trade in something that's good for the better thing, for the best thing, right? In previous seasons of my life, I had some pretty good things going on. I have a good amount of accomplishments that I did before I fully submitted to the Lord. I knew the Lord. I prayed to the Lord. I know that it was by the strength of Jesus that I was able to accomplish those things. But then there comes a time when you are ready to step into, okay, God, like for real, what is your plan for my life, right? And so it may actually be a trading off of something that is good, something that's even great, maybe, for the better and best thing. And so even if your life is good, if it has not reached the level of purpose and authenticity of the true version of you, the true calling that God has in your life, the true purpose that God has for you, then, ultimately there's a better and best that's waiting on you. And so once you know that, once you've gone through this journey, God has shown you who you are. God has shown you who he is. God has told you, who he called you to be, who he created you to be long before, he created you, he formed you in your mother's womb. Then you are responsible for what you know. And that's the hard part too. Some people avoid this journey because they're like, low key, I don't even want to know, because once I know, ignorance can be bliss as long as you're ignorant, right? Ignorance is bliss. Is like, as long as I don't know, I'm not responsible for it, right? But once God gives you a revelation, once God gives you, instruction, once God gives you understanding of who he is and who you are and what he wants you to do, and he gives you instruction on how to begin walking in that thing, you are then responsible to go forth in obedience by his power, by his might, of course, with his grace, of course, but you're responsible for the information that you know. And so don't avoid the journey just because you want to sit in ignorance, because at the end of the day, there's a level of responsibility that we will have even for not having sought out this information from God, even from not having, yielded to, because a lot of times, sometimes God will seek us out, and drop little hints that he wants to commune with us, drop little hints that he wants to draw us near, drop little hints that he wants us to seek him more, because there's more that he wants us to know. And so at the end of the day, you don't want to leave this earth never having scratched the surface of being, one, the true you that God created you to be, and two, doing those things that he originally sought out for you to do in the earth. And so rise to the occasion and begin to walk in it. That is the thing you have to do. Once then it requires you to come up higher and start being that. It requires you to come up higher and start walking in it, and so who is up for that journey today? Some of us have already been on this journey. Some of us are at the culmination of all of, some of those steps that I explained. We have left things, we've left people, we've left jobs, we've left, places, we've left parts of our identity that we thought were parts of our identity that really weren't, that were just, temporary, that were just, cultivated by the spaces we were in. But regardless, some of us are at the end of that, and it's like, okay, now you know the things, and now it's time to go do the things. Now you know the things, now you know the true you. It's time to start walking in the true essence of who you are and leaving behind the old version of you, the version of you that was a lesser version, that was not the authentic version. Some of us are in the middle. Some of you guys, have recently left something, and you are in that quote unquote wilderness period where you're like allowing God to cultivate within you who he is and who you are, where you're allowing him to shed things from your life, from your heart, from your mind, shed old mindsets and different things like that. And some of you are on the sidelines waiting for someone to give you permission or to push you in. And so let this be your push today, or let this be your permission today, that it is time to go ahead and seek out God. One, get to know who he is deeper, not what other people say about him, but know him for yourself. Ultimately, the gospel is built on a relationship and not on rules. And so if all you've ever heard was other people telling you that God is like this or God is like that, God expects this of you and he doesn't expect that of you, etc. Those things can help you. But at the end of the day, if you do not have a personal relationship with Jesus, then, there's limits to how you will allow him to move in your life, how you will allow him to lead you, and how you will yield and submit to his perfect plans. And so, ultimately, some of you guys are waiting on that push, that permission. This is your push and permission to seek out God today, get to know who he is. Seek out God today, get to know who you truly are. Again, away from what the world says that you are. And then, commit to the journey of allowing God's plans to unfold in your life. Now, the Bible does say that the steps of a good woman or a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in their way. And so, there is a trust that God has guided many of our footsteps up to this point, even without us knowing, brought different things into our lives up to this point without us even, intentionally yielding. But then there's things on the other side that when we give up our lives in exchange for the life that he has for us, there are beautiful things that can happen. And I'm not going to pretend with you that there isn't an in-between, because there's definitely a journey in between. When we think about the disciples, Jesus came to them and said, every single one of them, if you go back and read in the book of Mark or Matthew or pretty much any of them, you watch Jesus walk up to them and say, hey, come follow me. And all they do, they leave their job, they leave their nets, they leave their tax collecting table, and they just follow Jesus, not knowing what the journey was going to be like with him. And they traveled and journeyed with him for, I think it was 3 years, throughout that time before Jesus left them to go forth and be who he truly called them to be from that beginning. And so there is an in-between, there is a training, there is a development, there is an unlearning and a relearning, there is, there's a journey in between. I'm not going to pretend like there isn't. But even when you look at their stories, the things that they were able to do when they walked in the trueness of who God says they were, when they left, the version of themselves that they had created, based on what was available to them in the world, being a regular fisher, being a tax collector, I don't remember what everyone else was, but, then they were able to be called disciples of Jesus, doing the things that he did in the ways that he called each of them to do it, and each of them manifested that, showed up in that in different ways. But either way, long story long, who is up for that journey today? Who is up for the charge today of getting to know God more, getting to know you more, and asking God, who am I for real? Who am I for real? Who did you create me to be? It is way past time for many of us to have that question answered by the Lord and not by the world and not by our own opinions and not by how we've been conditioned. And so I encourage you today, like I said, I'll end on this note and just say, I pray you give yourself a chance to discover what God said about you long before you were born. You deserve to know your identity and to walk in that fully and unapologetically. And so I love you guys bunches. I hope you have a healthy and wholesome Saturday. I will talk to you soon, God willing.